What if I told you that electric cars could have dominated the streets in the 70s, but someone stopped them? During the 1973 oil crisis, the world stopped. Literally, gas stations were empty, prices soared, kilometer-long queues formed, and economic powers found themselves hostage to something that until then they seemed to control: oil. For the first time, the world understood what it meant to depend on an energy source that was in the hands of few. And it was at this moment of collapse that a unique opportunity arose. The question is, why was she buried? The oil shortage should have been the perfect catalyst for an energy transition, and for a moment, everything seemed to point to that. Behind the scenes of the automotive industry, electric vehicle projects began to be resurrected, prototypes gained attention, and alternatives to the combustion engine began to be seriously discussed. Yes, electric cars were about to make a comeback, and with force. But as you already know, they didn't come back, at least not at that moment. What happened? Who was interested in stopping this advance? What you're about to discover is that the oil crisis could have been the beginning of the electric revolution in transport. But much bigger and much darker set interests tried to make sure that didn't happen. Because for some industries, chaos was an opportunity. But the change? It was an unacceptable risk. During that period, while people waited hours to fill up their cars, some automakers have begun revisiting old electrically powered car designs. General Motors, for example, even reactivated studies with compact electric vehicles. Independent companies began to emerge with visionary ideas. Small startups that wanted to take advantage of the moment to present solutions that did not depend on oil. The press even published articles about the future of electric mobility, and even the US government briefly considered subsidizing the development of alternatives. The opportunity was there. The world wanted and needed something new. But like so many times in history, what the people needed, it wasn't what the powerful wanted. Oil was not just fuel. It was power, control, economy, policy, and the advancement of clean, silent, and independent technologies represented a direct threat to all of this. This is where the story starts to get darker, because what could have been the beginning of a new era was sabotaged. In this video, you will see how the crisis that almost forced the world to change ended up being manipulated to keep everything exactly as it was, and more, how electric cars almost saved the future, decades before Elon Musk, but were silenced, forgotten, and erased from the official narrative. The question is, if the electric car was viable in the 70s, why did it disappear again? Who profited from this setback? And the scariest thing, how many times has this story been repeated, without us realizing it? Watch until the end and find out how the past was ready to change the world, but the future was blocked by those afraid of losing control. You've heard the story of Tesla, Elon Musk, and the electric revolution of the 2000s. But what if I told you that this revolution almost happen 3 decades earlier? And more, that everything was going to work out, until greater forces stepped in and pulled the handbrake on history. What are you about to see in this video? It's not theory. It's a fact. In the 1970s, as the world descended into the chaos of the oil crisis, a unique opportunity has opened up to radically change the way we move. It was the chance to start again. The fuel shortage showed that the current model, based on oil, combustion, and external dependence, was fragile, volatile, and dangerous. And it was exactly at that moment that electric cars are back in the conversation. Not as a concept, not as futuristic fantasy, as a practical solution. Real, viable. Automakers began to unpack forgotten projects. Prototyping that had been dormant for decades was revisited. Governments issued notices and asked for alternatives. Specialized magazines spoke of an electric renaissance. The public was receptive. The timing was ideal. And then, everything disappeared. This video will show you how an idea that was almost born was aborted. And more than that, It will explain to you why innovation, when it threatens profitable structures, is never received with enthusiasm. It is fought. You need to watch until the end because we will reveal which automakers already had prototypes ready for mass production. You will discover how electric vehicles were effectively tested on the streets in the mid-1970s. You'll see how optimistic reports disappeared from the media from one year to the next. And mainly, how the crisis was used to further reinforce dependence on oil instead of replacing it. You will get to know behind the scenes of this silent sabotage. You will understand why the solution did not fail. It was buried. General Motors tested the XP883 in 1969. Sebring Vanguard produced hundreds of electric city cars shortly after the 1973 embargo. AMC and Chrysler participated in discussions with federal agencies to encourage electric mobility. All of this happened, and almost no one talks about it. Why? Because it was not interesting for the population to see the solution as possible. It was more convenient to leave everyone believing that it wasn't time yet, that the battery was weak, that the reach was limited, that the cost was high. All of this while strategic investment and influence decisions were being made behind the scenes. And there's more. The energy crisis served as a smokescreen for reinforced billion-dollar agreements with oil companies, guarantee subsidies for the exploration of new reserves, and restructure energy policies that favored, guess who? The same as always. Meanwhile, startups and independent projects that tried to move forward with electric vehicles faced political, legal, and financial barriers. And not by chance. Many of these entrepreneurs report to this day that they were intimidated, ignored, or simply suffocated due to lack of access to resources, even with viable and technically validated proposals. Do you think this is a coincidence? So keep watching, because this video will prove to you that the oil crisis almost became the turning point for electric mobility, and was, on purpose, transformed into an opportunity to keep everything as it was. Let's connect the pieces. The abrupt increase in oil prices, public pressure for alternatives, the immediate reaction of automakers, and the sudden disappearance of all advances within a few months. This pattern repeats itself to this day. Crises open gaps, but not always for progress. Sometimes they are exploited to reaffirm the control of those who are already in charge. And if you think we're just talking about the 70s, wait until you see how this cycle reappears in the 90s, 2000s, and even now. Every time the world moves closer to a cleaner solution, someone benefits from the delay. Watch until the end, because the history of electric cars, it didn't start with Elon Musk. It almost started in 1973. And understanding why it didn't work out back then is essential for understand what is still at stake today. In 1973, the world experienced an energy collapse that would reveal how vulnerable modern civilization was. All it took was a strategic move by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, for everything to change. With the embargo imposed on countries that supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War, oil prices quadrupled in a matter of weeks. Suddenly, gas stations in the United States had queues for kilometers. Signs announced "no fuel," and the news showed scenes of drivers sleeping in their cars, waiting for a shipment to arrive that might not even arrive. The impact was devastating. Inflation soared, the economy retreated, companies closed, and, most importantly, dependence on oil went from uncomfortable to unsustainable. It was in this desperate scenario that the electric car, a practically forgotten technology, was once again considered a viable solution. And here begins one of the most fascinating, and least told, parts of the history of mobility. During the first decades of the 20th century, electric cars came to compete with combustion models. They were quiet, clean, and much easier to operate. But due to several factors, especially the rise of cheap oil, the infrastructure created for the combustion engine, and the heavy marketing of large automakers, electric cars were being abandoned. Until 1973 came, and everything that seemed stable collapsed. Suddenly, the questions came back. What if there was an alternative to oil? What if the electric car had another chance? The answer at that moment seemed to be yes. The crisis created an ideal scenario for the resurgence of a technology that had been discarded before its time. The public was receptive. The American government began discussing incentives for the development of alternative energy sources, and some automakers responded. General Motors, for example, presented the XP883, a compact electric car prototype based on the Chevrolet Vega chassis. With a futuristic design and powered by nickel-zinc batteries, the project was tested, but was never put into production. Sebring Vanguard, a small company in Florida, launched the city car, electric micro-vehicle with a modest range but ideal for urban travel. Between 1974 and 1977, more than 2,000 units were produced, enough to draw national attention and generate articles in newspapers and magazines. Other smaller companies also entered the race. Elcar, Jet Industries, Electricar Corporation, all with proposals that, although technically limited, represented a new beginning. And the public response? Surprisingly positive. People were tired of the chaos at the stations, tired of the feeling of dependence, tired of paying more and more for a product that they did not control. The electric car momentarily became a symbol of autonomy and hope. The United States government even launched the Electric and Hybrid Vehicle Research, Development, and Demonstration Act in 1976, a law that provided incentives for research into vehicles powered by alternative sources. There was money, there was demand, there was motivation. So, what went wrong? The answer is not in a single decision. You are in a sequence of choices, pressures, sabotage, and giving up. Because at the same time that some companies were moving towards change, others were working behind the scenes to keep everything as it was. Oil industry lobbies acted forcefully in Washington. Lawmakers began to push back. Incentives evaporated. Credit lines promised to startups in the electricity sector were never released. And larger automakers, which had initially signaled support, quietly recalled their prototypes. The narrative in the media also began to change. Initial enthusiasm gave way to skepticism. Newspapers began to publish articles saying that the batteries were not yet ready, that electric vehicles did not have enough range, or that the driving experience was too bad for the average consumer. It was the convenience speech. It is necessary to slow down an idea that was gaining traction too quickly. The second oil crisis in 1979 even temporarily reignited the debate. But by that time, the system had already adapted. Oil dependence was once again a fait accompli, and the electric ones, once again pushed into oblivion. But the most interesting thing, and the most disturbing thing, is realizing that none of this was by chance. It was a calculated combination of political timing, economic pressure, and narrative manipulation. In other words, it wasn't that electric cars didn't work out, it was because they didn't let it work. If this story sounds familiar, it's because it repeats itself. What happened between 1973 and 1980 is a mirror of other moments when the world found itself faced with the possibility of change. And it hasn't changed. In the next block, we will reveal how the same interests that profited from the chaos mobilized to slow down the electric transition, and how that decision, made quietly behind the scenes, set the course for global mobility for the next 4 decades. If the oil crisis of the 1970s brought the world to its knees and offered the perfect chance to adopt a new energy matrix, why didn't it happen? The answer is not just in technology, nor in costs, nor in lack of consumer interest, as they have tried to convince us for decades. The answer lies in the fear of rupture. And every time a new technology threatens to change the rules of the game, those who profit from the current system try to pull the brakes, silently and strategically. Behind the scenes of that turbulent decade, 3 major power blocks mobilized to prevent the advancement of electric vehicles: the traditional automotive industry, the oil complex, and the political industrial lobby. Together, they formed what we might call the invisible barrier to the future. Let's start with the automotive industry. At the time, companies like General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, and other American giants were completely rooted in a production model based on the combustion engine. The entire infrastructure, from assembly lines, suppliers, to workshops and dealerships, revolved around this system. Switching to electric vehicles meant starting over. It meant redesigning products, reinvesting in technology, replacing parts, training mechanics, changing agreements with distributors, and, most importantly, losing control over maintenance. The electric motor requires much less maintenance than a combustion engine. No oil, no exhaust, no complex ignition system. This would be a direct blow to the automaker's entire after-sales network, which makes billions in profits from inspections, parts, and services throughout the useful life of each vehicle. In other words, it was not interesting that the electric car would work. And then the second group enters the scene, the oil industry. The United States was, and still is, highly dependent on fossil fuels. In 1973, around 35% of the oil consumed in the country came from the Middle East. The oil crisis exposed this fragility, but it also revealed the power that oil gave to certain corporations and nations. For Big Oil, a world of electric cars was a direct threat to demand. Fewer gasoline cars meant fewer gas stations, less refining, less fuel transportation, less political power. Electrics meant decentralization, and decentralization is the last thing a monopoly wants. These companies invested heavily in disinformation campaigns, commissioned studies that showed the limits of electrical technology, political pressure to remove subsidies and create unfavorable regulations. Oil lobbies began to act with force behind the scenes in the American Congress, using their influence to weaken any policy that encouraged electric vehicles. And finally, the third pillar, the political-industrial lobby. In the midst of the Cold War, the USA was concerned with economic and military supremacy. Oil was still seen as strategic, not just as an energy source, but as a geopolitical asset. The oil industry financed election campaigns, maintained ties with the Pentagon, and directly influenced White House decisions. When the federal administration passed the Electric and Hybrid Vehicle Act in 1976, hope seemed to be reborn. But the first stabilization in oil prices was enough for political enthusiasm to evaporate. Budgets were cut. Research has slowed down. Incentives for startups have disappeared. It was as if the system breathed a sigh of relief that it no longer needed to change. Meanwhile, electric vehicles began to fly off the shelves. Projects that were in the final testing phase were shelved without explanation. Small companies like Sebring Vanguard that had tried to stay alive with electric microcars were unable to compete with the giants and went bankrupt. And then came the final blow, the narrative. The press, often financed by advertisers linked to the automotive or oil industry, began to repeat an almost unanimous discourse. Electric cars are not ready yet. They are not trustworthy. The public is not interested. This discourse was planted, nurtured, and repeated until it became common sense. But the truth is that electric cars in the 70s were ready enough. They weren't perfect, but no new technology is at first. They just needed time, investment, and support. Three things that were denied in an orchestrated way. This silent sabotage delayed the development of electric mobility by decades. And all because those at the top didn't want to risk losing their position. In the next block, we will show the real consequences of this decision, the world that could have been, and the urban, environmental, and economic chaos that came precisely because we chose, or rather, because we were forced, to remain dependent on combustion. The question is, what if we had made the right choice in 1973? Imagine a world where electric cars had become the standard as early as the mid-1980s. Imagine quieter streets without the incessant roar of combustion engines. Imagine the air of big cities, free from the toxic smoke that we now breathe daily. Imagine neighborhoods where the predominant sound would be birdsong, not the sound of exhaust pipes. This is not science fiction. It was a real possibility. But she was interrupted, ignored, break with intention. And the price of that choice is still charged today, by all of us. When the oil crisis hit in the 1970s, the world had the perfect chance to do something different. The structure was there. Technical knowledge, popular will, momentary political openness. The momentum came, but it was not sustained. And this condemned us to more than 4 decades of regression masquerading as progress. Instead of accelerating the energy transition, we doubled down on oil. Instead of decentralizing transportation, we have become even more dependent on fossil fuels. And instead of democratizing access to clean technologies, we reinforce the dominance of the giants that controlled the game. The consequences of this choice are visible everywhere. Just look out the window. Today, we face critical levels of air pollution. According to the WHO, more than 7 million people die each year because of exposure to pollutants in the air, much of it from the burning of fossil fuels in transport. Our cities are hostage to chronic congestion. Millions of productive hours are lost every day in endless traffic queues. This affects the economy, mental health, quality of life. The mobility model based on combustion cars has transformed cities into hostile environments. The sidewalks were replaced by carriageways, the trees by parking lots, social interaction through isolation on wheels. And it could have been different. Not ideally perfect, but significantly better. In the 70s, electric vehicles had limited autonomy, yes, but for urban travel, they were more than enough. With encouragement, investment, and time, we would have overcome these challenges in the 1980s. We would have developed better batteries, charging systems, smart infrastructure. What's more, we would have drastically reduced geopolitical dependence on oil, which has fueled wars, economic crises, and global instability. Not just that, we would have made room, much earlier, for a new generation of clean technologies. Solar panels, decentralized energy networks, integrated public transport models, all of these would have evolved stronger, faster. But what did we do? We chose, or rather, we were led to choose, the most profitable path for a few, and more costly for the planet. The big corporations won. They maintained their monopolies, their profits, their influence. And what about the common citizen? There was a trail of smoke. Global emissions have exploded. The climate began to change. Respiratory illnesses have increased. The urban crisis has become the norm. All this because at a key moment in history, we let the future slip through our hands. But the saddest thing is knowing that this decision was not the result of ignorance, but of interest. The choice not to invest in electric cars was not technical. It was strategic. It was politics. It was calculated. And today, we pay the bill. The world that almost was, cleaner, quieter, more balanced, is in the archives, in forgotten reports, in prototypes that rotted in industrial warehouses. It's in the memory of engineers who tried and were silenced. It's in the newspaper articles that celebrated a new beginning and then disappeared without explanation. And if you think this is all in the past, think again. Because the model that rejected the electric car in the 70s is the same one that tries, to this day, to delay the advancement of renewable energy. It's the same thing that questions the viability of clean sources. It is the same thing that resists the decentralization of energy power. It's the same one who profits from delay. In the next section, we will explore how this pattern continues to repeat itself today and how the story that almost changed the world in the 70s can still be revived, if we are willing to face the real owners behind the wheel. Because the future is not locked in by technology. He is held back by the same old ones. And now that you know all this, here's the question that bothers you. Is there still time to change course? Could it be that, even after decades of delays, sabotage, and missed opportunities, the electric revolution can still truly happen, and not just as marketing? The answer is not simple, but it starts with an observation. The technology has been ready for a long time. She just wasn't allowed to grow. Today, we have batteries that far surpass those of the 70s. We have infrastructure starting to emerge, although still far from ideal. We are environmentally conscious like never before. We have companies trying, despite the barriers, but we also have the same obstacles as always, the same lobby, the same resistance as large industries, the same manipulated narrative. The forces that buried electric cars in the 1970s haven't disappeared. They've just changed. Tactics. Today, they act with more subtlety, disguised as regulations, disguised as economic realism, disguised as a responsible transition. But the logic is the same. Keep power where it has always been. Prevent mobility, energy, and innovation from escaping the control of those who profit from the current model. The difference now is that we know this. We have information. We have a voice. We have tools to question, share, demand. And that changes everything. The question that remains is, are we going to keep postponing the future until it's too late? Or will we look back, recognize the mistakes, and prevent them from happening again? What happened in the 70s was more than a lost moment. It was a warning, a rehearsal, a chance that was canceled, but that can still teach us. Because every crisis hides a choice, and the next big choice may already be before us. Comment below, do you think we still have time to reverse this delay, or are we repeating the same mistake, just with prettier technology? Like, share, and subscribe, because in the next video we will reveal other innovations that were sabotaged in the past, and that could have changed everything if they had been allowed to exist. See you there.